In early 2022, something happened that had never happened before. Somewhere over the South China Sea, American F-35 stealth fighters had an encounter with Chinese J-20 fighters. It wasn't a fight. As far as we know, they just crossed paths. In March, the US Air Force acknowledged that the encounter took place, without saying when or where. The People's Liberation Army finally followed suit a few months later. It's not that unusual for military aircraft to meet in contested airspace. But there was something very unusual about this encounter in particular, because the J-20 was heavily based on US stealth fighter technology that China stole from American defense contractors, which made this random blink-of-an-eye encounter the culmination of China's years-long campaign to steal US military technology. And in this video, I'm going to tell you how they do it, and why they won't stop.
China often steals American intellectual property.
They try to advance the interests of a corrupt state.
We see that China exponentially increasing their R&D investments, and this effect is multiplied by what they steal from us.
Chinese military espionage is a war that's being fought in the massive shadow cast by the broader US-China strategic competition. To most people, it's invisible, but it's actually super important because it directly threatens the national security of the United States and its Western allies, while also endangering American companies and strengthening the Chinese government's ability to maintain an iron grip on power. The military technology involved in all of this is so classified, it's rare to learn the names of anyone involved. But there are a few people whose stories help us to understand how and why the Chinese government steals US military technology, like Su Bin. From the outside, there wasn't a whole lot about Su Bin, or Stephen as he was known to his English-speaking friends, that aroused suspicion. He ran a small Chinese aviation technology company that focused on manufacturing aircraft cable harnesses, and together with his wife, he owned a nice house in Richmond, British Columbia, just 20 miles from Canada's border with the United States. Su was all about business. Over the space of a few years, he cultivated networks of people within the aerospace industry. Most of them probably just thought he was slightly too eager to make a business deal. But unbeknownst to them, Su was actually secretly orchestrating the theft of more than 500,000 classified files from some of the world's biggest defense companies. He was especially interested in any files related to the Boeing C-17 transport. The C-17 might have looked like an unusual target, but it actually made a lot of sense. Since it first entered service in 1995, the C-17 has become an effective way for the US and its allies to transport troops, vehicles, and supplies to the front lines. It's even used to transport the US president's armored limousines around the world. Any military that wants to project force over large areas needs a reliable transport aircraft. But American intelligence agencies knew that the Chinese Air Force had been struggling for years to develop one of their own. Although the C-17 was made by Boeing, the company relied on dozens of smaller contractors. That supply chain provided Su with lots of opportunities for infiltration. His mission was clear. His method was simple. After he identified potential targets, he'd pass their details on to 2 Chinese military hackers he was working with. The hackers would then send phishing emails to individuals at the targeted companies. Usually, the emails were made to look like they came from a colleague or someone else in the industry. When the target clicked on a link in the email, it took them to a website controlled by the PLA, which downloaded malware onto their system. This gave the hackers remote access to restricted networks. Once they were inside, they sent lists of what they found back to Su. Using his technical knowledge, he would direct the hackers on what files to exfiltrate. From there, the hackers covered their tracks by routing the documents through servers in several different countries. Eventually, the files were deposited on machines near Hong Kong and Macau. At that point, Chinese military officials picked them up in person, took them back to China, and paid Su for his work. Su and his partners had unfettered access to Boeing's network for 3 years before they were discovered. During that time, they stole more than 600,000 files about the C-17. But that wasn't all, because they also stole tens of thousands more files about the F-22 and F-35, the world's most advanced fighter planes. In the end, the hackers were partly undone by their own bragging. In 2011, one of the Chinese officers who worked with Su emailed the other, attaching a report detailing the success of their operation. It was basically a confession. Su was arrested in Canada and extradited to the United States. And in 2016, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison by a court in Los Angeles. But his mission was already a success. In November of 2014, the People's Liberation Army debuted the Y-20 cargo plane. It just happened to bear a striking resemblance to the Boeing C-17. There was even a C-17 parked nearby at the air show where the Y-20 was first unveiled. It looked like the PLA had managed to come up with a solution after all. Like I mentioned, Su Bin and his accomplices also managed to steal information about the F-35. But that wasn't even the first time that had happened. As far back as 2007, Chinese hackers infiltrated Lockheed Martin's networks and stole terabytes of data about everything from the F-35's radar systems to its engine schematics. In 2009, the Wall Street Journal reported another cyber attack, this time targeting the F-35's electronic systems. Chinese hackers were apparently so successful that before being discovered, they covertly sat in on what were supposed to be secure online press conferences. And in late 2016, a small Australian aerospace company that subcontracts with the Department of Defense was hacked, and documents about the F-35, C-130 transport aircraft, and Australian naval vessels were stolen. The hackers didn't have to try very hard. An investigation found that the company's internet-facing services still had their default passwords. The Chinese government's patience would soon pay off.
On Tuesday, all eyes were on the Chinese-made J-20 stealth fighter. It's armed with long-range missile. And if it looks familiar, that's because it bears a striking resemblance to the F-35 and F-22, warplanes made in the United States.
There's something slightly unusual about the fact that Chinese government hackers expended so much energy and effort to steal information about the F-35. The F-35 might be the most widely criticized warplane ever.
The F-35 was born of an exceptionally dumb Air Force PR spin.
It started with incredibly high hopes when the contract for the Joint Strike Fighter, a program created by the US military in order to develop a superior, versatile fighter plane, was awarded to Lockheed Martin in 2001. But the program has been plagued by a series of design problems, delays, and cost overruns. By 2017, less than 2 years after the first F-35 entered service, the F-35 was forecast to cost $1.5 trillion over its lifespan. So it sort of raises the question, if the F-35 is so bad, why did China try so hard and for so long to steal it? Well, because despite all the problems with the F-35, it's still one of the world's best fighter planes. And stealing the technology that underpinned it allowed the Chinese government to take a big step forward in their grand geopolitical strategy. Su Bin's operation was highly successful until he got caught. But that didn't bother the people who ordered the operation, or their bosses, because he was ultimately just one foot soldier in a huge army of Chinese hackers dedicated to stealing the West's most sensitive commercial and military secrets. Over the last 2 decades, China has built an enormous cyber espionage network. One of the main nodes of that network was a 12-story building on 208 Datong Road near Shanghai Airport. It may have looked like a regular, boring office building, and in some ways it was. Personnel had access to a medical clinic and a kindergarten. But it was also the office of a secret PLA cyber warfare unit. Unit 61398 exists almost nowhere in Chinese government documents. You're more likely to find references to it in US government documents. A secret State Department cable written in 2008 mentioned an attack by a Chinese hacking group codenamed Byzantine Candor, which stole more than 50 megabytes of emails and a list of account details from a US government agency. They were talking about Unit 61398. Still, the public was completely unaware of its existence. Until, that is, an American cybersecurity company released a report which, among other things, identified the unit as the one that was behind the theft of the F-35 designs. For 7 years, Mandiant secretly monitored the activities of Unit 61398's hackers. Over that time, the group was responsible for at least 141 attacks, which cumulatively stole hundreds of terabytes of data. Mandiant watched from the shadows as Unit 61398's hackers stole blueprints, manufacturing processes, clinical trial results, pricing documents, negotiation strategies, and other proprietary information from more than 100 of its clients, mostly in the US. More than 20 industries, from defense contractors to chemical plants, mining companies, and telecommunications corporations were targeted. And Mandiant also learned, through analyzing their techniques and tracing their IP addresses, that Unit 61398's hackers were working out of the same building, that nondescript 12-story office on Datong Road. It's kind of ironic. By uncovering Unit 61398, Mandiant showed exactly the kind of ingenuity and talent that made so many American companies prime targets for Chinese espionage operations. The report made headlines across the world and alerted everyone to the threat posed by systematic state-sponsored Chinese espionage. In May of 2014, the Department of Justice indicted 5 members of Unit 61398. Everyone knew there was no chance the hackers would be extradited to face the charges. But it was still a sign that the Obama administration was willing to publicly call out China over its ongoing theft of corporate and military secrets. However, China was about to up the ante.
More than 21 million Americans had personal information stolen from government files in a data breach that was 6 times as large as originally disclosed.
The OPM hack resulted in the theft of 22 million security clearance files on American officials, military personnel, contractors, and intelligence officers. Intelligence agencies realized what it meant. The Chinese government was assembling a massive database of almost everyone in the American national security community. The fallout from the OPM hack was huge. The CIA couldn't move some of their officers to China because they were concerned their covers were blown. And the Obama administration offered millions of Americans credit protection in case the hackers had their credit card numbers. The arrest of the Unit 61398 hackers and the OPM hack made Chinese espionage the biggest issue in the US-China relationship. And it led directly to what looked like an incredible breakthrough.
The United States government does not engage in cyber economic espionage for commercial gain. And today, I can announce that our 2 countries have reached a common understanding on the way forward. We've agreed that neither the U.S. or the Chinese government will conduct or knowingly support cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property, including trade secrets or other confidential business information for commercial advantage.
The US-China cyber agreement felt like an arms-control deal for cyberspace. And on the surface, it seemed to achieve results. The security firm FireEye released a report a year after the deal, which claimed that the number of successful attacks by the Chinese hacking groups it was tracking fell by more than 80%. Soon after signing the agreement with the United States, Xi Jinping signed a similar deal with the United Kingdom. Was the Chinese government actually about to stop its espionage activities? Spoiler alert, no, it wasn't. Up until about 2014, the PLA was the main force behind China's espionage operations. But the unmasking of Unit 61398 and the public identification of 5 of its members was a major embarrassment. It ended up being one of the factors behind Xi Jinping's decision to reorganize the People's Liberation Army and purge several of its leaders. As part of the reorganization, power was centralized within the Ministry of State Security, a powerful agency that combines elements of the FBI, CIA, and NSA. Suddenly, the same organization that monitors Chinese people at home was given the job of stealing secrets from China's rivals. This centralization of power coincided with what, on paper, looked like a decline in Chinese cyber espionage attacks against American companies and organizations. But the truth is, that was deceptive. Most of the decline actually took place before the agreement was announced. And China kept hacking. It just turned its attention to places like Russia and Southeast Asia. And although we'll never know for sure, it probably took some time for the reforms within the Chinese government to play out, and for the Ministry of State Security to acquire new high-value cyber espionage targets within the United States. Chances are Xi Jinping knew all of this when he stood next to Barack Obama in the Rose Garden. He never had any intention of stopping Chinese espionage operations. He probably just wanted to gain a diplomatic advantage while buying himself some time to increase his government's capacity to conduct them. And after years of Obama's diplomacy, Xi Jinping was about to deal with a very different US president.
China, 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 China. China.
One of Donald Trump's signature policies as president was his trade war against China. He'd been talking about unfair trade practices for decades, and finally, he had a chance to do something. Now, I'm not going to argue whether or not the trade war was a good idea, but in terms of preventing espionage, it was a failure. And the truth is, it was never going to succeed, because nothing that Trump or any US leader could have done was going to dissuade Xi Jinping from the strategy he'd chosen. So far, I've talked about how China steals US commercial and military technology, but now it's time to zoom out and ask a really important question. Why does China steal US technology? Right off the bat, let's get something straight. Every country conducts espionage. They view it as an integral part of national security, and every country knows that other countries are conducting espionage on them. It's a routine part of geopolitics. But there are 3 things that make China's espionage activities different. Let's go through them one by one. First, the purpose. Su Bin explained it perfectly in one of the emails that was used as evidence against him. The F-22 and F-35 documents he helped steal would, in his words, allow China to catch up rapidly with US levels and stand easily on the giant's shoulders. The Chinese Communist Party, led by Xi Jinping, is on a mission to surpass the United States as the world's preeminent military and economic leader. And the two go hand in hand. As China's military becomes more powerful, it's able to exert more influence in the Indo-Pacific, coercing its rivals and extracting more value out of things like trade deals. But making that ambition a reality requires making quick leaps. And China's leaders have decided that, rather than doing it the old-fashioned way like investing in R&D, the best way to catch up quickly is by stealing US technology. The J-20, the plane that had that close encounter with the American F-35s over the South China Sea, is a perfect example. It's only the third, fifth-generation fighter in the world, behind the F-35 and F-22, the two planes its design is based on. The J-20 is designed to dominate the skies over the South China Sea, one of the most contested regions in the entire world. Xi Jinping sees it as a key part of China's ability to project military power in the region. In the event of an actual conflict, say over Taiwan, the J-20 will be one of the main ways that the Chinese military tries to deny area access to US naval vessels and aircraft. As China's world influence expands, so is its military. Beijing's goal is to surpass the United States. And although China's leaders would prefer to do it peacefully, if there is a war, they want to level the playing field. Second, the scale. The scale of Chinese espionage activities against the United States is staggering. Credible estimates from 5 years ago put the annual cost at $320 billion. Some of them are lower, but we're still talking about tens of billions of dollars every year. And of course, that's only the espionage that we know about. There are plenty of reasons why an intelligence agency or defense contractor might not disclose that they've been hacked. So the true cost of China's espionage activities is probably a lot higher. China has a bigger hacking program than that of every other major nation combined. According to Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI, the agency opens a new China-related counterintelligence case about every 10 hours. You might have noticed that I'm not making much of a distinction between military and economic espionage. There's a reason for that. Neither does China. China doesn't make this distinction either. Article 7 of China's National Intelligence Law states that any organization or citizen shall support, assist, and cooperate with the state intelligence work in accordance with the law. In China, the line between the government and the private sector is so blurry that it doesn't exist. Many large Chinese businesses are state-owned enterprises. And even if they aren't, the government still controls them. Just look at Huawei. Espionage is a state policy in China. And it will remain that way as long as the Chinese government isn't subject to any constraints on its power. Third, the means. The Chinese government uses a diverse range of techniques to conduct espionage. Sometimes it cultivates an intelligence asset like Su Bin, using him to identify targets and then hacking those targets. Another technique involves enticing people to covertly share knowledge with China. In 2019, a Texas-based scientist was convicted after he stole trade secrets regarding syntactic foam, an important naval technology used in submarines. The state-owned enterprise that benefited from the theft even ended up patenting the manufacturing process they stole, and then offered the American company a joint venture. That was an example of another famous Chinese espionage technique, coercing American companies to share or give up their intellectual property in order to access the Chinese market. The techniques are diverse, and so are the technologies. We know what technologies China is most interested in because they've told us. The Made in China 2025 strategy, announced by Xi Jinping a few months before the US-China cyber agreement, identifies specific industries like aerospace, automation, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing where China should gain an advantage. Today, almost all of China's espionage focuses on those industries. Like I said earlier, when we talk about Chinese state-sponsored espionage, it's rare to learn about people's real stories. But sometimes there's a story which perfectly encapsulates the broader issue. In March of 2017, an engineer at GE Aviation received a LinkedIn request from an official at a university in eastern China. GE Aviation was an ideal target because it builds airplane and helicopter engines for the Pentagon. And the engineer was an ideal target because he grew up in China. Like most people who use LinkedIn, he was used to getting requests from strangers. He accepted the request without thinking too much about it. A few days later, the official invited the engineer to the university to give a research presentation. The engineer felt honored at the recognition. Before he moved to the US for grad school, he'd grown up in a small village. Now he was being asked to share knowledge about aerospace engineering. Plus, he'd get to see his family and friends. It was a dream opportunity. There was just one problem. The engineer knew that if he asked, GE wouldn't give him permission to go. So he didn't ask. Instead, he clarified with the official from the university that he'd only discuss general research on composite materials, not anything he was working on at GE. No problem, the official said. After the engineer gave the talk, he was handed an envelope with $3,500, reimbursement for travel, and a payment for the talk. He went back home to the United States, and that was the end of the story. Except, of course, it wasn't. A few months later, the engineer got a call asking him to attend a meeting with GE security officers. He was already feeling tense. Earlier that day, he and his teammates had been asked to hand over their hard drives and then their laptops. His worst fears were soon realized. The officers wanted to know more about his trip to China. Where did he visit and why? The engineer said he just went back for a college reunion and to connect with friends and family. Wrong answer. The security officers told the engineer that a couple of FBI agents wanted to talk to him. In fact, they were already in the building. They entered the room and started asking the engineer questions about the trip. He stuck to the story he gave the security officers. Finally, exasperated, the agents showed him their evidence that he had visited the university. They reminded him that it was a crime to lie to federal agents, and they asked him again, what did he do in China? Eventually, the engineer confessed. He said he'd given a presentation about designing airplane parts from composite materials. Although he was careful not to divulge any proprietary information, he had downloaded some GE training files to help him prepare. The FBI agents knew something I'm sure you've already picked up on. His hosts were trying to use the engineer to steal trade secrets. Eventually, the agents offered a deal. They wouldn't recommend charges if the engineer agreed to participate in a counterintelligence operation against China. The FBI had already searched the engineer's home, towed his car, and caught him lying. Some of the GE documents he downloaded were marked export controlled. He was in big trouble, so he said yes. The FBI was especially interested in Chu Hui, a local bureaucrat from the Jiangsu Science and Technology Association who'd presented the engineer with some loose-leaf tea in Nanjing. They believed that the association was a front for the Chinese government and that Chu was actually an intelligence officer. They saw an opportunity to learn more about Chu and about China's espionage operations. In December, a month and a half later, the FBI directed the engineer to write to Chu over WeChat, saying that he'd like to visit China again over Lunar New Year. By the time Chu wrote back to say he could make that happen, the FBI already had search warrants for 2 of his email addresses. They also discovered that each of the addresses were linked to an Apple ID and iCloud account, so they obtained more search warrants. Much like how Mandiant had shown just how many US companies were targeted by Chinese espionage, this discovery was a funny twist of fate. The iPhone, a product of American technological and business prowess, was a key asset in the fight against a rival nation's efforts to steal technology. One of the iCloud accounts was a treasure trove. All the proof the FBI needed was there. It showed that Chu's real name was Su Yanjun, and that he worked for the Ministry of State Security. The FBI found his national ID card, pay stubs, and even his vacation requests. But the biggest piece of treasure was an audio recording from 2016 where Su urged a professor at Nanjing University to work harder to obtain military technology. Quote, "The leadership asks you to get the materials of the US F-22 fighter aircraft. You can't get it by sitting at home." Learning their target's true identity significantly raised the stakes for the FBI. It gave them solid proof that the theft of trade and military secrets was orchestrated by Beijing. The FBI wasn't satisfied with just knowing who Su was. They wanted to arrest him. They instructed the engineer to keep up the correspondence. Su eventually asked for material relating to the design of a particular type of fan blade. The engineer sent over a GE document, but it was bait. GE, which was cooperating with the FBI operation, altered it so that it didn't contain any valuable information. Su bit. He sent the engineer a list of technologies to collect. The engineer, again appearing to comply with the request, emailed Su a copy of his laptop directory, only GE had stripped out all of the sensitive information. He then mentioned that he'd be traveling to France on a work trip in March of 2018, a year after he received that first LinkedIn request. The engineer suggested meeting somewhere away from his GE colleagues, like Belgium. Su thought he was really getting somewhere, but in truth, he was walking into a trap. The FBI thought France wouldn't arrest him, but that the Belgians would. In March, the engineer flew to Brussels. But Su, the Chinese intelligence officer, was in the Netherlands. He was frustrated by the change of plans. Maybe he suspected something was up. So he proposed a compromise: meet in Rotterdam, which was closer to the Belgian border. All of a sudden, the FBI needed a reason why the engineer couldn't come to the Netherlands. If they didn't think of one, the entire operation might have fallen apart, but they came up with a good one. The engineer's boss had booked an Easter lunch for the whole team, and attendance was mandatory. He needed to be in Belgium. Sue finally agreed and sent the engineer a photo of a coffee shop in a historic gallery in central Brussels. The meeting was arranged for 3 p.m., but it never happened. Sue went to scope the location beforehand, accompanied by a colleague. As the two men approached the coffee shop, Belgian federal police officers arrested them. The two men were carrying $7 grand in $100 bills, money they were going to give the engineer. 6 months later, Sue was extradited to the US to face charges of economic espionage. Sue and the engineer had lots in common. Both saw academics as their ticket out of poverty. They were both born the first people in their families to go to college, and they both studied engineering. But at a fateful moment, their lives diverged. In 2003, the same year the engineer left for the US in a new life, Sue started working for the Ministry of State Security. When Sue's trial began in October of 2021, the prosecution presented a recording of a 4-hour-long meeting between him and several Chinese engineers. In the meeting, he explains how to spot potential recruits while targeting specific technologies. Quote, for example, if I am an aircraft person, then I would search for Boeing or Lockheed, right? Find it at Lockheed Martin. After I found the person, I would find out if this person is doing something, like in charge of overall designs or avionics. Digging deeper, they made another discovery. Starting in 2010, Sue helped run a campaign that targeted 3 aerospace companies, Capstone Turbine, Safran, and Honeywell, which supplied components for China's first ever domestically manufactured commercial airliner. A Safran engineer installed malware provided by Sue onto the laptop of one of his colleagues. Sue's defense attorney tried to argue that he was just a pawn caught up in the competition between 2 world powers. It didn't work. In November of 2022, Sue was sentenced to 16 years in prison. Sue's arrest was like capturing an enemy combatant during war. But it's an unusual kind of war. No shots are being fired. No missiles are being launched. But unless America is able to effectively counter Chinese military espionage, the US faces the real prospect of fighting a future conflict against a rival equipped with technology based largely on the innovation of American companies. As a senior US defense official put it to the New York Times, during the Cold War, we were focused every day on the nuclear command centers around Moscow. Today, it's fair to say that we worry as much about the computer servers in Shanghai. And the danger is that as the US develops more advanced weapon systems to counter China's growing military threat, China will just try its best to steal that technology too. In August of 2023, 2 US Navy sailors were arrested in Southern California for providing military secrets to Chinese intelligence officers. It was proof, in case we needed it, that Xi Jinping will keep trying to steal US military technology. Because stealing military technology sits at the heart of his strategy to increase China's influence in the world and ultimately overtake the United States. Beijing has already gained terabytes worth of information on advanced US weapon systems and used that information to build its next generation of aircraft, drones, and missiles. But the fight is never over. The US and its allies must increase their resilience against Chinese state-sponsored espionage. It must continue to invest in research and development, both in the military and corporate sectors. It must always strive to show the rest of the world that democracy and openness is better than authoritarianism and censorship. To learn how the US military needs to change in order to defeat China, just watch this video next. Thanks a lot.